You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The NFL saw two offseason-defining quarterback moves yesterday that didn't directly involve the Chicago Bears, but will have an indirect impact on how this team operates moving forward. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at Cox. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we take a look at Aaron Rodgers staying in Green Bay, what that means for the Bears, Chicago, Justin Fields, Matt Eberflus, the whole 9 yards, the sort of impact of that deal on the Packers and how that affects everything we're going to be watching closely here for us in Chicago. And then we'll also talk about the Russell Wilson blockbuster trade to the Denver Broncos, how that was almost the Chicago Bears making that blockbuster trade a year ago. Reportedly, in that conversation, making offers, having those deals, discussions at the combine with the Seahawks, ultimately not pulling the trigger. And we'll kind of look at what that deal would have looked like when you compare it to the Broncos deal, but from the Bears' perspective, and what that would have meant for the Bears, what path they would have been on with Russell Wilson versus what path they're on now with Justin Fields, and which one we'd rather be on. But we need to start with Aaron Rodgers, because that's the one that's closest to home right now. Of course, it's a little bit murky, specifically what his contract is going to be. It was initially reported as 4 years, $200 million with like 150 plus guaranteed. Aaron Rodgers himself and Pat McAfee have both sort of said like, hey, the deal is not ink dried signed yet in terms of like the exact specific numbers, just that Rodgers is agreeing to return to Green Bay for sure. It's just, specifically the number, amount, and guaranteed and stuff still needs to be worked out. And so, of course, Packers fans going around trying to not dunk on Bears fans, but just dunk on everybody and sort of say, see, haha, our MVP quarterback is back. And of course, it's like, oh, see, aren't all you other fan bases, especially Bears fans, going to be miserable now because it was supposed to be Justin Fields' division? And I'm like, I don't know, man. It's kind of what we've been used to, right? This is not anything new, right? The Packers have not added anything here. They've just continued with what they have had so far. And when you combine Rodgers' contract with the Devontae Adams contract, yes, Rodgers' deal is reportedly supposed to be team-friendly in the first couple of seasons in order to keep that cap hit down to not cost too much space, but it is going to cost them on the salary cap eventually with that much guaranteed money. They are going to have to pay some money here. Yes, the salary cap will go up, and that's not the big point here, but it is part of this. But I also think it's not worth Bears fans being overly worried about or overly concerned or disappointed or depressed about, because I just don't think it's that monumental. That's not to take anything away from how good Aaron Rodgers is as a quarterback, but a couple different dynamics come to play in here. First of all, the Bears play the Packers twice a year. There are 15 other games on the schedule. So even if Aaron Rodgers is still going to be, king of the NFC North or whatever, the Packers are still going to win a lot of games. Even if the Bears lost every game to the Packers for the next 4 seasons, they still have 15 other games each season to show that they're what they can do and to still make the playoffs, to compete in the division, to go and push your way to the top. And you don't have to beat Aaron Rodgers to be successful as the Chicago Bears. You want to, and you can make that argument too of like, you want to beat the best and play against the best and stack up with the best and be better than the best. And so there's a competitiveness aspect to having Aaron Rodgers in the division, but also there's a heck of a lot of other games on the schedule that can still get you very, very, very far, regardless of what happens with the Green Bay Packers. Plus, then, okay, so then you maybe have to face Rodgers in the playoffs. Well, he hasn't exactly been a great playoff quarterback, right? He lost to Jimmy Garoppolo this past season. It has regularly dare I say, choked. Can we go as far as to say choked in the playoffs? The Packers and Aaron Rodgers have. So let's not pretend that Rodgers dooms the Bears from any sort of success, right? What will determine whether the Bears have success or not is Matt Eberflus a good coach, and is Justin Fields a great quarterback, and is Ryan Poles a good general manager, right? Aaron Rodgers is not going to determine whether or not the Bears are a successful team. He's not going to be is he going to be the thing that keeps them from winning the Super Bowl at some point? No, and of course not. If they're good enough, they can beat Aaron Rodgers, especially as he gets later and later in his career. I also think this Aaron Rodgers saga is over for now, but I guess I don't fully trust that it's over permanently. Because if you think about it, it's not really about the money. It was about chip with the general manager and the team president and feeling disrespected by them not really listening to him and also drafting his replacement and wanting the relationship and the say in the organization to improve. So yes, they give him the big contract and that helps too, makes him happy. But what happens 2 years from now when Aaron Rodgers is in his 40s and they're going to need to replace him eventually, right? They're going to need some contingency plan eventually. They're going to need some quarterback to replace him. And when they do that, is he going to be unhappy again? Will that relationship with management stay all hunky-dory like it is right now? Or a couple years from now, is it again going to not be about the money and just be about their relationships? And could we have more Aaron Rodgers drama for Packers fans to deal with a couple of years from now, right? I think this will smooth it over for a little while, and that's fine, and they can do that. But I'm not convinced that this is all going to go away super quietly and Rodgers just gets to ride off into the sunset. And it just seems like there's room for this to still eventually become a problem again and not be fully problem solved. Plus, I just think it's a little less pressure on Justin Fields too, that like if Rodgers was gone, it would be, okay, Justin, this is your division. You should be the best quarterback. Step up and do this. Now, not that you want him to hide in Rodgers' shadow, but there is a shadow there to where he doesn't, the pressure is still going to be high on Fields, but it's not as national, like, oh, okay, you got to own the division right now because Rodgers is gone. Instead, it's like, okay, Rodgers is still there, so you don't have to be Rodgers good. You can just be Justin Fields good, and that should be just fine. So I don't know. It's Packers can have their fun, and good for them for Aaron Rodgers or whatever. But life goes on. Life goes on for us in Chicago. Certainly feeling better than Seahawks fans are right now, having just lost Russell Wilson. And boy, that feeling could have been the other way around for, I guess, the Broncos fans celebrating getting Russell Wilson. That could have been Bears fans last season. We'll look at this Russell Wilson trade and kind of apply it to, okay, what would it have looked like then if you took about the same compensation but made it the Chicago Bears instead last year? We'll go through that and more next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, Built Bars. They really are better than any other protein bar product I have tried, and I've tried quite a few of them in my day. Some of them are pretty good tasting, but are loaded up with a bunch of like extra sugar, and they're super high calorie. And some of them are supposed to be really good for you, but taste like cardboard. Built Bars truly are the best of both worlds because every Built Bar is soft and easy to chew. It's covered in 100% real chocolate, and it tastes like a candy bar. But most importantly, Built Bars are low sugar and low calories and still high protein. We're talking 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar in most flavors, and 17 grams of protein. It truly is an unmatched protein bar product anywhere else on the market. You got to try them for yourself. Head on over to built.com. Enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. The Denver Broncos certainly didn't get 15% off trading for Russell Wilson, a massive haul for the Seattle Seahawks. It still feels like the Broncos won the trade, considering they didn't have to give up any of their super premium young players. But of course, 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, tight end Noah Fant, defensive lineman Shelby Harris, and of course the quarterback Drew Lock all go to Seattle in exchange for Russell Wilson and a 4th-round pick. And we were having these conversations with the Chicago Bears last season, right? Initially, there was talk. The Bears were in on a lot of those veteran quarterback trade rumors, right? Briefly, some Matthew Stafford discussion, although I don't think Matthew was ever going to go within the division to the Chicago Bears. And then, of course, I don't think the Bears were going to give up 2 first-round picks for him the way the Rams did. Then there was the Carson Wentz discussion around the Chicago Bears. We all kind of feel like dodged a bullet on that one. But most Bears fans were pretty on board with Russell Wilson, depending on what the trade compensation price was going to be. And now that he's a Bronco, it's a clear, like, what if in Chicago? So say draft pick compensation is probably going to be about the same. It would have been, last year's first plus this year's first, which the Bears used to take Justin Fields, I should mention, but then also last year's second and this year's second, but then 3 players, right? A young tight end, a veteran defensive lineman, and a quarterback. Does that directly one-to-one translate to, say, Cole Kmet, Akeem Hicks, and Nick Foles would have been the tight end, D lineman, and quarterback? I mean, maybe they would have liked Bilal Nichols instead, although both of them are now entering free agency, so they would have been one-year deal type trades. I don't know if they have quite the same value. I don't actually know Shelby Harris's contract off the top of my head, but like Shelby Harris is a fine defensive lineman, and Hicks and Nichols each have sort of their question marks here and there. I suppose not anything against them; they're both talented players too. But Harris has been really solid for them, and Noah Fant is certainly a more proven, successful tight end at this stage of his career too than Cole Kmet. And same with Nick Foles versus Drew Lock. I think the Seahawks would much rather have Drew Lock in terms of a young quarterback on a rookie contract that might still have something untapped in him, whereas we kind of know what Nick Foles is. So, maybe it's not specifically a tight end, a defensive lineman, and a quarterback. They probably wanted a quarterback in return, probably would have taken Nick Foles in that exchange because Trubisky would have been going into free agency and not tradable at that time. So, would have been Foles, but then, other players. So, I think the key here for the Broncos is, right, they didn't give up Patrick Surtain, their first-round pick at cornerback, right? They didn't give up Jerry Jeudy, their first-round pick at wide receiver, or Cortland Sutton, their top wide receivers, right? The Broncos didn't have to give up, like, their top-of-the-line young talent. Noah Fant was, like, 1B, right? He's a good young tight end. Don't get me wrong. It's not anti-Noah Fant, but he's not Patrick Surtain, Jerry Jeudy, high-level first-round pick type prospects from the Broncos that will be long-term foundational pieces for their future. So it's more that second tier of player, which is why I think Cole Kmet fits that tier a little bit more for the Bears. He's still young, still untapped potentially for a team like the Seahawks, but then other players the Bears could have potentially put in there. At that stage, I don't know, would Darnell Mooney be in that before this season, right? So entering after Darnell Mooney's rookie season, very promising. And we didn't want to get rid of Darnell Mooney, but in a Russell Wilson trade at that time, a year ago, before Darnell Mooney had another really, really strong season, would we have been more inclined to give up Mooney in a potential Russell Wilson trade? Maybe. It depends. It's hard. It's hard to have that fair hindsight on that because of how good Darnell Mooney looks. And he looked great as a rookie, but even better now in year 2. But I don't know. I think James Daniels could have been in that conversation. Cody Whitehair in that trade conversation, maybe even David Montgomery, potentially. I mean, right, David Montgomery's a great young running back, but is he untradeable, like essential part of your long-term future? I mean, yes, he's very good and important, but much like Mooney, it's like if you're getting Russell Wilson and you truly believe he can be the difference maker for you at quarterback, you entertain that conversation, right? Like I don't think a year ago you're not trading Jalen Johnson in the Russell Wilson trade. You're not trading Khalil Mack in the Russell Wilson trade. You're not trading Eddie Jackson in the Russell Wilson trade. Like these are foundational pieces of your defense. And of course, Mooney became a foundational piece of this offense. And maybe you can argue David Montgomery is too, but running back value is a little bit murky. But then I wonder on a veteran standpoint, if a year ago, right, before this past season, if Robert Quinn would be in that Russell Wilson trade, because Bears fans are ready. We're all ready to get rid of Robert Quinn after last season. And maybe Seattle would have taken a flyer on him, or maybe Eddie Goldman had just opted out. So I was going to say maybe Eddie Goldman, but he had just sat out the whole season. So I don't know that his trade value would have been phenomenal. But all of that wouldn't have left, whatever combination of 3 of those guys wouldn't have left a ton around Russell Wilson. When you think about what the Bears had around Andy Dalton and Justin Fields this season, plus then you lose your first-round picks and your second-round picks. So, no Tevin Jenkins in that regard, no second-round pick this year would be, some of these younger players on this roster wouldn't be a part of that conversation. You would still have your wide receiving core be, pretty much the same, a banged up, unproductive Allen Robinson, a relatively ineffective Goodwin and Bird, although would that change if Russell Wilson was your quarterback? Probably. So maybe that's not totally fair, but the offensive line concerns at times would still be in that conversation because, the Bears would have still had to make all the same salary cap moves they made last season, right? To create space, but they would have had to create then even more space for Russell Wilson's contract. They cut both their offensive tackles. They cut Kyle Fuller at cornerback, right? All of those things would still have had to happen with Russell Wilson, but then you would have even less salary cap space because you'd be paying Russell Wilson more than you're paying Justin Fields and Andy Dalton and what the Bears ended up paying at quarterback. I mean, I guess the one thing you would have had was a great connection between Jimmy Graham and Russell Wilson being reunited. That would have been fun, right? But doesn't necessarily make up a whole offense. The way, the Denver Broncos are leaving him with still Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Albert O from Missouri, their other big young tight end whose last name is impossible to pronounce, Tim Patrick at wide receiver. I mean, they have depth at wide receiving core. They have young players in the secondary. They still have some pass rushers. Offensive line is getting there. I mean, this is not a Denver Broncos comparison, but just, they do still have young pieces because they didn't trade away their cornerstone young guys in Denver. Plus, they can still add some more in free agency this year. And they still have, I think, another second-round pick and I think 4 or 5 picks in the top 115. So, right, Denver was in a better position to trade for Russell Wilson than the Bears were last season. And I can't help but feel like had the Bears traded for Russell Wilson, we wouldn't be, I don't know, it's hard to say like for sure like a better or a worse place, but the grass might not always have been greener with Russell Wilson. We'll kind of go through what last season might have looked like with Russell Wilson, some of the different dynamics in there, and where that would leave us where we are now with Russell Wilson instead of Justin Fields, next on Locked On Bears. If the Bears had been able to trade for Russell Wilson a year ago, the way the Broncos just did now, almost assuredly, Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy would still have their jobs, right? Russell Wilson is a good enough quarterback that they would have won more games than they won this year with Andy Dalton and Justin Fields. But I guess I wonder, is that better? You know what I mean? Like, of course, Russell Wilson is a sure thing at quarterback, a 9-time Pro Bowler, a Super Bowl winner, would instantly be the best quarterback in Chicago Bears franchise history. There's no doubt that, like, at the time, trading for Russell Wilson would make sense to like try to win football games. I mean, the Bears may have been a playoff team this past season with Russell Wilson because, again, he makes Darnell Mooney better, he makes Allen Robinson better, he makes Cole Kmet better, he makes the running game better. I mean, he probably makes the offensive line better. He never had great offensive lines in Seattle, so he was able to sort of make things work there. But sometimes he can hold on to the ball a little bit too long. But so can Justin Fields. So I suppose there's a little bit of push in terms of that side. But I don't know. Would you rather be a borderline playoff team right now, trying to retool a little bit more around Russell Wilson with Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace, or would you rather be fresh start with Ryan Poles, rejuvenation a little bit from Matt Eberflus, and some healthier? I guess they don't have first round picks still from the Fields trade, but like more of that long-term go younger at quarterback type rebuilding strategy here, that they're not rebuilding, but like retooling, that the Chicago Bears are kind of doing. Because I just don't fully trust Matt Nagy to have adopted his scheme enough to Russell Wilson's skill set, because he shares some similarities to Justin Fields in the sense of Wilson being a great deep ball thrower, a guy who needs a little bit of extra time to let some of those plays develop a little bit more downfield so he can sling it. But Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, I mean, vertical receivers in that offense, was where they were at their best. And too often in Seattle, they would be overly focused on running the ball the way we wanted to see the Bears run the ball last year or this past season with Justin Fields and Andy Dalton, because they needed to run the ball more with ineffective quarterbacks. But with Russell in Seattle, they were a little bit like too heavy on the running game sometimes, but then also they couldn't run the ball consistently, but they kept trying to stick with it. And they'd force him into more of these underneath throws, much like we complained about Matt Nagy doing with Justin Fields, right? It was too much of trying to put him in these 3-step curls and slants. And if you're having Russell Wilson throw those all game, which there were complaints about that happening in Seattle too much, are you having some of the same problems, right? How much how much better, how much is the ceiling for Russell Wilson with the Chicago Bears last season, and sort of would hypothetically then moving forward with him into this next upcoming season. It's hard because we don't know what exactly the team, if you had Russell Wilson now, but less, not a first or second round pick this year, you could still, in theory, bring in some wide receivers the same way we're talking about bringing in, and bring in some offensive linemen. You would probably have a little bit less cap space to do so, but you wouldn't be in salary cap hell the way like Green Bay is trying to dig themselves out of now with the Rodgers and Devontae Adams contracts here. So I don't know. Would you rather be the sure thing of Russell Wilson's probably going to get you to 10 wins fairly consistently, but you're stuck with Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace and whatever ceiling that might give you? Or do you prefer the unknown ceiling, but also currently much lower floor of Justin Fields and Matt Eberflus, right? So there's a decent chance, or there's some chance, let's say, that Justin Fields never gets you to consistently winning 10 and 11 games each season, that he just isn't, for whatever reason, doesn't develop into that quarterback, and the Bears aren't able to successfully build around him that way. And then all of a sudden, maybe you would rather have Russell Wilson for another, 5 years or whatever, however many more years of his career you're going to get. But at the same time, is Matt Nagy the coach and Ryan Pace the GM that's going to get you to a Super Bowl with Russell Wilson? I mean, we all kind of came to the conclusion that they were not the right guys for the job, in part because of their inability to build around Justin Fields. If you had traded for Russell Wilson, you would have had the whole offseason to build the plan around Russell Wilson the way they seem to kind of do with Andy Dalton. So, maybe there's some more, maybe is that too unfair to Matt Nagy to say that, well, if he had Russell Wilson, maybe he would have been more inclined to switch up the scheme and not feel like he knows better than Russell Wilson comparatively to like thinking he knows better on how to develop Justin Fields. I mean, maybe it would be a little bit different, but it's tough. I mean, could Ryan Pace's late round magic make up for the missing first and second round picks? You find a couple other gems, you sign a free agent receiver, 2 offensive linemen, or 2 retool the defense, and all of a sudden, Russell Wilson is pushing for that, second to like the division round playoffs, maybe a conference championship type run. And maybe, he's a Super Bowl caliber quarterback for a reason, but I think we'll also see sort of how things go in Denver and how quickly he assimilates with that. And if they have instant success, maybe we'll look back and say, maybe it would have been worth it for the Bears, or maybe we'll see an aging Russell Wilson who's been injured and less productive lately. Maybe he won't be as rejuvenated in Denver. And of course, Seattle wasn't really interested in trading him to an NFC team. Reportedly, the Washington Commanders offered more than the Broncos did in terms of first-round picks, and Seattle said, no, we want to send him to the Broncos instead. So maybe the Bears weren't fully in serious contention there, but I don't know. It'll be one of those sort of what ifs. Certainly, if Justin Fields is great, we won't question it, and we'll be glad the Bears didn't trade for Russell Wilson and all that stuff. If Justin Fields doesn't pan out, certainly hindsight would be 2020 in that regard, but I don't know. It's a fun thing to look back on when you see a blockbuster trade that can kind of reshape some of the landscape of the NFL, and know that, hey, the Bears were in on that discussion earlier and ultimately decided to go in another direction. What would have happened with Russell Wilson in Chicago instead of Justin Fields, and of course, instead of Russell Wilson in Denver? It'd be fun to kind of see how things pan out that way. And then, of course, what the Bears do instead to try and prove that they made the right path. We'll certainly keep a close eye on any and all free agent developments, any other big trades this offseason. We'll certainly see what happens with Mitch Trubisky potentially going to a new team to start somewhere this offseason, and so much more. So I hope you'll keep tuning in 5 days a week to the Locked On Bears podcast and subscribe for more daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On NFL podcast is breaking down all the breaking news as it's come out. Plus, our friends at Locked On Seahawks are reeling. Corbin Smith is having a rough day with Bobby Wagner released too. We'll talk about him as a potential Bears free agent fit as the week goes on here. Big day for Cody Rourke from Locked On Broncos. Not going to mention the Aaron Rodgers podcast. You know where you can find that too, on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day, but your team is the Chicago Bears. And I hope that Locked On Bears has made it that much easier for you to bear down.